Chuck was the former United States Deputy Secretary of Agriculture under George Bush. And so I met Chuck here, oh man, it's been several years now, at a board retreat, a local cooperatives board retreat in Indiana, and got to know him and know a little bit about his faith and his priorities. And so it's really a great honor for us to have you here, Chuck. I'm going to turn this over to you, and I'll go exit the stage here while you go ahead and share with us what's on your mind here.
All right, Kevin, we can get some video. I think I'll be ready to go.
The video you're wanting, do you have the, all right, you got it. There you go. Perfect.
All right, I think I got let in. Now we're ready to go. Kevin, thank you. Let me just get situated here, folks. And this is my first time on this platform, so I appreciate things being a little different for me. This is also a different type of forum than I'm used to speaking at, Kevin. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about what I do, but perhaps in a different context than what I am allowed to share in my general work life here in Washington, D.C. It's a real pleasure for me to be a part of this kind of opening program, if you will, for the Farmer Legacy Network, and I'm very, very honored to be part of it. So I'm going to talk a little bit. I'm going to share some stories with you, which I normally don't do. Stories about a little bit about my life, but hopefully at the end wrap all of this up into a little bit of perspective of what's going on in this crazy world of politics and public policy right now, and maybe hopefully end on some optimistic tones, although in today's world that is challenging to be optimistic, just to be perfectly candid. Let me just start by telling each one of you that I was raised on a farm in a Christian home in a small, very small farming community in Indiana. I accepted Jesus Christ as my Lord and Savior and believed from a very early age in my life. And frankly, I tell folks I would not have understood really the perspective of anyone who didn't believe the way I did or my family did. My childhood, I think, was about what you would expect from a farm kid from Indiana. I saw and observed my dad pray for rain. I saw and observed him praying for clear skies. I saw my dad get devastated and literally knocked to his knees when crops were lost or when disease and death came to farm animals. But the impactful thing for me, folks, is that I never saw my parents lose faith in the fact that no matter what the perils were on that farm, and in some cases they were substantial, God is greater and has a plan for each one of us, and for that farm in Benton County, Indiana, bigger than drought, bigger than hail, bigger even than death. You know, in my small farming community, I really cannot remember any farm family who was around me, who I knew well. And of course, you knew everybody in that small town, but it didn't really know anybody who was not a man or a woman of faith. You know, to really put a seed in the ground every year with the hope that for that crop, amongst all of the issues that are just completely out of your control, you know, that is a leap of faith to engage in that kind of operation. And I have generally found that farmers, they do ultimately, in order to survive and in order to keep their own sense of well-being, know that there is someone greater in charge of all of that. And they put their faith in that person for rain, for the crops that sustain their family. And of course, that person is our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. Let me just roll forward a little bit and say that I got started in my public policy career in the early 1980s. And some of you with gray hair like me, or perhaps no hair at all, will recall what farming was like during that period. We were working with so many farmers in the state of Indiana who were in a desperate means and engaged in a desperate attempt to save themselves. And we tried to help as many farmers as we could. And I will just share a story with you of remembering being on a farm in southern Indiana, where this particular farmer had already lost all his cows. They had been taken by the bank. And he was desperately trying to hang on to his land. She had made pot roast for us that I still remember what it tasted like to this day. But what I remember most was that that farmer, before we consumed that pot roast, before we ate, prayed over our meal. A prayer that I rarely forget, where he gave thanks to the Lord for providing for he and his mother, acknowledging that the Lord was sovereign over all things, in all circumstances, no matter what the outcome of his plight was. And I will just tell you, folks, that to this day, I remember that as a prayer that would melt even an atheist's heart. And it impacted greatly my desire to continue to work on farm policy and always do what I can to give farmers in this country a better shake. Now, as a result of this work, folks, I did experience some success in my work life. My career in Washington and in public policy and helping farmers, if you will, blossomed. And frankly, I finally recognized that for me, God wanted me in that kind of work rather than at home engaging in farming, which I always thought was something that God wanted me to do. I finally, I would just, it's tough to know how to describe this because this is a touchy topic for me, but I will just say that with that blossoming career, I had the opportunity to work and serve with the very, very highest ranking leaders of our government, including presidents of the United States. And I will just tell you, to my personal shame, that I at times carry with me even to this day, I went from being that humble farm kid from a farm in rural Benton County, Indiana, to one who was far too proud of my work accomplishments. And to the point, again, to my shame, where I think I was arrogant towards others that, frankly, I thought had not put their life all together the way I did. And this was a low point in my own spiritual journey. I was living, or so I thought, through my job and all of its accomplishments and all of its accolades. But in reality, I had forsaken the Lord and was totally depending upon my own abilities. Once the full impact of my life change hit me, I will tell you, it was again a low point in my spiritual journey, and I wondered really if the Lord could forgive me, and could he really change what had become an awfully dark side of my personality. And again, I will just tell you that during this time, I was deeply encouraged by my pastor at the time, who encouraged me to truly meditate and study the final hours of Jesus's life after the Last Supper and prior to his crucifixion. The betrayal, the abandonment, the denials, the spitting, the cursing, the mocking, and of course, ultimately, the nails that he received. These passages were powerful to me, and to this day continue to serve to remind me that Jesus got what I deserved. And it was far more than enough to cover the darkest parts of my personality, and it is certainly more than enough to cover anything any one of us have done in this world. In more recent years, I will just tell you folks that I have struggled to maintain optimism of what I will call knowing Christ in my work life because very candidly, it does seem as if our country is a bit on a wretched course. And I hate to say that, but it's got to be how I feel, and I know it's how many of you feel as well at this point. I feel comfortable sharing these remarks with you, but know that these remarks would also raise some eyebrows if I were giving this to a group of people of my peers in Washington, D.C. You know, and we all know John 14:6, which says, "I am the way, the truth, and the light. No one comes to the Father except through me." This is again a verse we know well in Christian circles, but in national politics today, quoting this verse could well get you labeled as a racist, perhaps a Nazi, or other terms meant to condemn. I did not think this was possible in the country that my father fought and almost died for in World War II. To be clear, ladies and gentlemen, and I want to be clear on this point, some of this criticism and some of this judgment upon us, judgment of fundamental Christian principles, is justified. Too often we have not modeled the grace that I need to model and that we need to model, but instead been judgmental against those who may look, behave, or perhaps believe differently than we do. And there is no place for this, folks, in our political system. And it serves to drive many to this day away from the Lord and not toward the Lord. But I can't help but wonder what future political elections will look like in this country. I can't help but wonder that. Can an evangelical Christian, and I'm going to shed a little bit of my own politics here, but I'm just going to say it to this crowd, can an evangelical Christian such as former Vice President Mike Pence, a gentleman that I know well, actually win a GOP nomination and not just get skewered in the general election for his or her faith? And what about the Democratic nominee? Think about it, folks. What would the media do today to a Democrat on a national stage who openly professed evangelical Christian principles? Skewered would not be the proper word. They would be maybe tarred and feathered would be an inappropriate way of describing it, but they would be so sharply criticized. This who question is particularly troubling to me when you analyze political elections and the who in terms of politicians and who they are fighting for today. 30 years ago, earlier in my career, we often talked about America being divided into thirds. A third being Democrat, a third being Republican, and a third being, what we would call truly undecided voters who oftentimes did not make up their mind who they were voting for until the very last minute. Political elections were determined by the voting patterns of literally tens of millions of those undecided voters. Today, in our political world today, pollsters claim that only about 5 to 6% of us are voters who are truly undecided. Lots of reasons for this, I think, but I do blame social media for much of this. I also blame the fact that in a Christian context, we are relational people. And today, the way our political system is set up, members of Congress do not have the opportunity to develop relationships with each other. And so just the general notion of working together and being social with each other and being respectful with each other is almost a thing of the past. We literally spend billions of dollars on our elections, all to battle over votes of a relatively small percentage of our electorate. Billions of dollars. And to make matters worse, much of the undecided voters today consist of the demographic of what I generally refer to as the under 40 crowd. This age group, again, I'm making a generalized statement here, but there's some fact behind this. This age group does not vote based upon any Christian principles, ladies and gentlemen. Overwhelmingly, this age group polls climate change as their number one political issue. In fact, many of them would tell you that climate change is their 1, 2, and 3 political issue. They believe our planet is on a time clock and not the kind of clock described in the book of Revelation. And I will talk more about climate change here in a moment. Now, I told you at the beginning that I was going to be a bit of an optimist here, and so far it doesn't sound very optimistic, and I know that I am giving you a pessimistic scenario for our political future and our Christian roots. But give me a chance here to lay out some practical, what I call on-the-ground analysis of our current state of play in Washington relative to the issues that are going to impact farmers and agriculture in the future. While politics in Washington has never been more partisan than what it is today, our world in agriculture, the good news is that it has stayed somewhat above the fray. And I will use this as an example. Senator Pat Roberts, whom many of you know from the state of Kansas, former Senator Pat Roberts, and Debbie Stabenow, the senator from Michigan, have shared the leadership role in the Senate Agriculture Committee back and forth for well over a decade. Folks, their voting records could not be more polar opposite than what they are. Him being more conservative, she being very, very liberal. But they worked in a bipartisan way on agriculture and farming issues and rarely had to even cast roll call votes in the Senate Agriculture Committee because of that way that they were sort of joined at the hips, if you will. For the most part, I see this continuing on in 2021 and beyond. And this does give me some hope for our political future in food and farming. Understand, again, folks, that I am saying this at a time when partisanship is at its highest point in our country's entire history, to a point where bloodshed has been the order of the day on both sides of the political aisle. But in agriculture, we have what I kind of loosely refer to as the big five out there. And by the big five, I'm talking about people. And I've already talked about Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, the new chairman of the Senate Agriculture Committee, and her desire to work across the aisle and to do what's right by agriculture. And on that committee, she's going to be joined in leadership by Senator John Boozman of Arkansas. Senator Boozman is a good man, and I'll just tell you that. He loves farmers and wants to do right by the American farmer and by agriculture. He's also a guy, he's a dentist, but if he walked into your local coffee shop and sat down and you didn't know who he was, you would think he might be, the guy living down the road in rural America. He's just a very, very good, laid-back man, and they will make a good team. And that, again, on the Senate Ag Committee, that is the reason to be optimistic about 2021 in the midst of crisis. Excuse me, just a minute. My throat is very dry today, so I apologize for the interruptions here. On the House Agriculture Committee, Congressman David Scott of Georgia and Congressman Glenn Thompson, a Republican from Pennsylvania, are the leader and ranking member of the House Agriculture Committee. They are new to the jobs, but again, these are seasoned veterans who have a history of laying aside partisan debate on the Ag Committee and working together and basically saying, what's right for farmers, what's right for rural America, and without that sort of having political undertones associated with it. And so those are, and again, our four leaders in the Congress. That's a good leadership team for us to get some things done. But perhaps I'm also equally excited about the fifth member of this team. And I remember I said this is the big five. The fifth member of this team is soon to be Secretary of Agriculture again, Tom Vilsack. Now, Tom Vilsack, I will just tell you guys, we know he's a Midwesterner. He hails from Iowa. He has been Secretary of Agriculture, had a good track record there. In the last 4 years, he's actually been serving the U.S. dairy industry and trying to promote export markets. Tom Vilsack is a good guy, and he's not one who is threatening to us, threatening to farmers, threatening to our faith in any way. And so, again, these are five people that I have great confidence in. It gives me optimism that in basketball terms, if you will, and a lot of my family coach basketball in Indiana. We're putting a darn good team on the court, and I think they're going to serve us well, serve us in a bipartisan way. And again, there's hope here in the midst of what the media would describe as sheer turmoil in Washington, D.C. So what does putting a good team on the court mean for us going forward at this point? Let me talk about a couple of quick issues for you, and then wrap up with a little discussion about the Farm Bill, and then hopefully we'll have time for plenty of questions at that point. What this means for us going forward, that we can actually work together, is I do feel like we've got a chance to solve perhaps what is one of the big long-standing problems of American agriculture, and a problem that I have worked on unsuccessfully for many, many years. And that is the issue of labor on our farms and ranches. Some of you may know, some of you may not know that within our farms and ranches, among our hired labor force, a very, very substantial percentage of that force consists of people who don't have the legal status to be in this country. Again, a majority of our workforce. Represented by somewhere, the estimates are somewhere around 1.1 to 1.2 million workers. So this is not a small problem among a handful of farms. You know, we used to think about this being a California problem. No, this is a problem in all regions of the country, just about in all farm types out there going forward. And, you know, it creates enormous uncertainty for us, and has for a long time, as these are individuals who sort of live in the shadows. From a faith perspective, it's frightening, because in many cases, and I've talked to many of these folks, they're good people. Sometimes they're even hesitant to get outside of their home, to get off the farm, to go to church to worship, out of fear of something happening to them, being caught there. You know, this is not a good circumstance for the worker. It's certainly an uncertainty hanging over the farmer and the rancher's head, you know, that is not an uncertainty they need, because obviously we've got a lot of uncertainties no matter what we do. We don't need to be putting self-imposed uncertainties upon ourselves. So this is something we've been trying to fix for a long time. And I think with the team we've put on the court, 2021 is a year where we've got a very, very good chance to fix this problem, and do so in a way that, again, preserves and sustains agriculture for the long term, because we do need these workers, ladies and gentlemen, in a mighty way. We could not provide the abundance that we provide to Americans and to a lot of foreign countries without these workers. And so, again, we're pushing very, very hard on this, and pushing our team that's on the court hard on this. I mentioned climate change earlier, and again, I can't stress enough the politics that are behind climate change at this point. I said the under 40s, this is their 1, 2, and 3 top issues. And think about it, it makes sense, you know, if you believe that our planet, you know, that we inhabit, that we live on, is on a clock, and many believe, and again, this is statistically, you can back this up, believe that we are on a 10-year clock, that 10 years from now, because of climate change, our planet will be uninhabitable for human life. Now, I think that's nonsense, but nevertheless, a big chunk of the undecided voters who determine the outcome of elections in this country believe this strongly. And so, folks, you can very well bet that we're going to address this issue at some point in the not too distant future. Joe Biden is the president of the United States today because he did well in that under 40 crowd. He had the right messages. He had the right climate messages to deliver deliver those voters in a very, very major way. And he's got, you know, if he expects to have any chance to seek re-election, he's got to be able to point to some victories here on their number 1, 2, and 3 top political issues, climate. Now, maybe that's bad news, you say. Here's the good news. Good news. There is a small group of us, myself included, that were part of this, and I don't say this in any way saying we had a lot of foresight, because I think it was a kind of an obvious sort of call, but well over a year ago, we sort of saw this trend coming as we were seeing some of the polling data for these under 40s. And we basically made a decision of, American agriculture needs to get out ahead of this curve. We cannot sort of be reacting to it and always responding to something that is happening to us, but we need to be proactive. We need to get a seat at the table and come up with some recommendations that are good recommendations. In this case, recommendations, I say good, they're science-based. They're not some internet chatter that the planet is getting ready to blow up. They're they're pure science-based, but ultimately as well that they are things that do, much as I started out this conversation by saying, I want to do right by the farmer. We want these climate recommendations to be good for the American farmer, not something where he feels like he or she has been, had their pocketbook raided in some way, or had less opportunities to pass that farm on to the next generation of farmers and ranchers out there. So as we looked at this, we began to pull a few folks together, what I would call kind of reasonable thinking folks, including some environmental organizations. And over time, we did determine that, yes, there's common ground here. And shortly after then, the November presidential elections, we released And so, unlike in the past where we dreaded climate debate and basically sort of prepared our defenses to keep it from happening, we're actually proactively looking forward to that climate debate, because we believe we've got the right science-based solutions to present and do so in a way, again, that is helpful to the farmer. And this is a different position than we've ever been in the past. Now, I don't want to leave you with the impression that this is a done deal. I mentioned again back to the under 40s and who they listen to in politics. And I will just tell you that President Biden has a big problem on his hands. He's got a big problem because, again, he was put in place by the under 40s for the most part. And some of the political leaders that the under 40s listens to are some people with some very, very extreme points of view, particularly as it relates to climate. Points of view that, frankly, growing up on that farm in Indiana, I didn't even know there were people that thought like that, to a point where they're fundamentally questioning, the freedoms of our country, the democracy that we have, the right to, to free speech. I mean, it's crazy stuff. But yet, these are political leaders that will have their say in this debate because, again, they were responsible for motivating the people that turned the tide of this election. Now, again, I think we can beat them. I think they're still they're too big, but they're still a minority, group within the Democratic Party. But as long as agriculture is together and united and speaking with one voice here, I don't dread the climate debate. And I actually think we can do some very, very positive things on climate going forward. But it's a risky debate, and I'm the first to acknowledge that. But again, we don't have any choice but to participate, because if we don't, then, there's going to be debate going on behind a closed door, and we're going to be banging on the outside trying to get in, and we won't. And that's never a position you want to be in. You want to be at the table, or what is it? Zippy Duvall from the Farm Bureau always says, you're either at the table or you're on the menu. And that's a pretty good analogy to describe what we face relative to the climate debate. Let me just wrap up again by talking a little bit about the 2023 Farm Bill. I just listened to Senator Stabenow, again, the new chairman, this morning speak, and she basically said she wants to get a very, very early start on the 2023 Farm Bill. And she does so because, she believes there's a lot of issues out there to be addressed, and is hoping maybe that some of them can even be addressed before we get, rolling on the 2023 Farm Bill, and perhaps even this year in terms of review of some of this. And, I think that's probably a good thing. Early starts are generally never a bad idea. but I do think it reflects the fact that this next farm bill is going to be a watershed farm bill. It's going to be one where there's going to be a fork in the road, and one fork, one half of that fork is going to take us more in the traditional direction where, the government's role in what you plant and how much you plant and acreage set-asides and that sort of thing is very, very limited. The other fork in the road is more of a progressive kind of thing where, you've got USDA back in the business of playing a much more aggressive role in sort of managing day-to-day commodity markets. And we have not had one of these watershed farm bills in a very, very long time. I think this is going to be one of them. And so it's one, that while we need an early start on, boy, we also need early work out in the countryside of pulling folks together to make sure that this is done right for American agriculture. Because again, if we're not in charge of our own destiny, others will be, and the outcome won't be pretty in that circumstance. So maybe, Kevin, I will kind of wrap up a little bit at this point. I know we've got some time here for questions. I may have a few other comments to make, but again, I just want you to know how honored I am to be a part of this Farmer Legacy Network sort of kickoff session. I'm humbled to be a part of that, just given, my own life and my own journey that's been, but just know that, my life is about serving our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. And I hope that if any of you ever see me not doing that, you certainly have my permission to call me on it. And the accountability in Washington is something that everybody needs, because this, as I've described, is not a town that recognizes or is warm towards, the core message of the gospel of Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the light, and no one comes to the Father except through me. And I hold to that principle, and Washington, I hope, never changes that principle for me or many of my Christian colleagues that I work and meet with regularly here in Washington, and there are many of us. So thank you again for the opportunity to share a little bit with you, and I hope we can have some questions and comments and dialogue at this point, Kevin.
Okay, Chuck, I'm going to join you here too. So if you have a question for Chuck, there's a raised hand icon over on the right-hand side of your screen, should be, and you can just hit that, and then we'll know to call on you. You'll be able to, that'll turn your mic on. You'll be able to ask a question. So Chuck, while we're kind of waiting here, I do appreciate your comments there. One is your journey, which I could relate to, right? It seems like it's so easy to get enamored by success, your own successes, and start to put a little bit more emphasis on what I did versus what's done through the talents and the gifts that God has given us. And so I appreciate your openness and your honesty there, and your frank forward discussion. Also, boy, you talk about things that really impact agriculture, right? Our political scene does definitely have a direct impact on agriculture as it forms regulatory, the regulatory environment in which we got to operate our situations, and also other things that can just really directly impact the ability to farm and produce a healthy food source for not just our country, but other countries. So very insightful there. So
Kevin, maybe while the folks too are, on your point, if I could just elaborate on that a little bit while folks are getting their questions together as well. This is one where I just so regret kind of some of the changes in political events over the last month or so. I mean, you guys know from my earlier comments, have a pretty good idea of what my politics are in Washington. And, it's not something we hide here in Washington, because everybody has strong political views, or you wouldn't be here, to begin with. But it just really bothered me, some of the events that unfolded, because, as I look back at a lot of the policy accomplishments, particularly on the regulatory relief front, there's an enormously good record there that Trump could point to in terms of achievements. And it sort of begins with waters of the U.S. and there's a whole lot more beyond that could have been a strong legacy for him. But I really fear, just given the events that have happened, and understand, I never thought he was going to be impeached to begin with anyway, but nevertheless, his legacy is marred because of all of these events, and we aren't going to have the opportunity to really promote and create a legacy out of some of those regulatory changes that are, really, really substantial. And I fear future administrations are going to be free to try and go back to some of the way things were before Trump on these things because of the fact that we don't have them as legacy issues now, and they should be. So it's an unfortunate development from all of this turmoil of the last 5 or 6 weeks.
No, absolutely. So we do have is there maybe there's somebody? There's a little echo going there. Can you hear me okay? Okay, Chuck, here's a question. What's your outlook on energy and ethanol and biofuels, and how will that affect ag producers, U.S. and around the world?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, Kevin. And let me just start by humbly saying that in all of my public policy, I have there's 2 things that I have managed to avoid ever letting myself get identified as an expert on, and one is ethanol, and the other is dairy marketing. And I just know enough about both to be dangerous, but not to be considered an expert. So you can't hold me accountable for it. Let me just say though, generally speaking on ethanol, I know it's been tough, and of course a lot of the members that I represent have really been struggling in this space a great deal. Going forward, I do take a little bit of the approach, there's going to be a lot of different forms of energy develop out there. Our climate debate that I've gone into in excruciating detail, is going to drive some change, in our power markets out there, not only in our power grid, but, in terms of electric vehicles and this sort of thing. That is going to happen. But I also look at the energy market in much the same way that I look at, sort of food consumption, generally speaking, as well. And that is, there's going to be ups and downs. But, folks, the trend line here, whether it's food or whether it's energy on this planet, is going up. I mean, we're putting a lot of bodies on this planet in a lot of different locations. And, invariably that translates into energy needs. And so I just believe, that there's going to be a big energy space here that many can play in and play in profitably. And that still, gives me encouragement going forward, even though I know, you could easily line up, Kevin, somebody that could come in here and just tell you that ethanol is headed for the skids. That's not where I am on this. I'm an economist. I'm not an ethanol economist, but more broadly speaking, I just believe this is still a growing market on this planet, and that's going to create opportunities for us.
Yeah, no, I knew your second one was going to be dairy. Economics you can get into when you get into.
Oh my gosh, I never have understood dairy marketing.
It's hard. It takes a pretty smart individual to get that, and I'm not that guy. We've had another question come in here that I'll read to you here, Chuck, and if there's more questions, folks, you can go over to that question icon on the right hand side and click there and type in your question as well if you are doing that. This question is: science is telling us that the sun goes through a 200-year cycle, and they're telling us that the next 10 years are going to be to bottom out the cycle called the grand solar minimum. How is the U.S. government and the governments around the world planning for this?
Well, I can't speak for foreign governments very well, Kevin. I can, I know our own U.S. government pretty well, and I will just tell you that within our political system, this has been somewhat the case throughout my career, but it is especially true now, given just the partisan nature. our political system is not designed today to address any issues on a prospective basis. The only, the way our political system works is if there is literally a crisis that is practically ready to knock us in the face, maybe the political system, can deal with that. But, to sort of plan out, 10 years in political terms is 10 decades to anybody else. And it's not equipped to do that. I'll use the example that we could probably all relate to, and that is, Social Security and its solvency. I think all of us know that Social Security is on a path here of, at some point, the money flowing out is going to be so much greater than the money coming in that, it reaches a point of no return. And people generally know what it takes to fix that. And that could be done. But it hasn't reached that crisis point yet. I mean, people still, the Social Security checks still come. They're still getting cash. The money is still there, even though we know the problem. And literally, unlike, this climate situation that was just described, this is very quantifiable of, sort of when that day of reckoning gets here. I can promise you Congress is not going to deal with that issue probably until a month before that day of reckoning. And that's just, again, the way the system has evolved over time. Congress doesn't address issues in advance. They respond to a crisis and sort of keep the doors of government open. And that in many ways is so fundamentally different than it was 40 years ago. I mean, that is ultimately the Congresses today consider themselves to have done their job literally if the government doesn't shut down. And so it's about the bar couldn't be much lower.
Thank you for that encouragement, Chuck. We appreciate more encouraging words there. We do have another question that came in from our friend Carl Hensley in Nebraska. It says, thanks, Chuck. Appreciate your message today. As you look at the under 40 crowd, what opportunities do you see for farmers and those in the ag industry to connect? The 40 and under group will continue to grow and the traditionalists will thin out.
Yeah. Kevin, it's a great question, Carl, and thank you for sending that in. Let me try and answer it this way. First, let me say, I'm certain I sounded like a very old man, when I'm talking about the under 40 crowd. I feel a little bit empowered to do that only because I've got 4 of them, in terms of my sons and daughters, and interact with them and know a lot about how they think, I guess. But to their, to sort of defend them a little bit, I'm a little bit of a product of the late 60s and 70s, and I talked about my dad a lot in my story. Well, from, kind of the hippie generation of that, that 60s and early 70s time period, my dad thought the world was turning upside down just, because of the sort of culture of the day and, the communes and everything else that became, part of that sort of culture. Well, what ended up happening over time, those same people that were, part of that, generation that my dad just shook his head at, they're sort of considered the conservative base of the Republican Party today, many of them, in fact, most of them. So they changed over time. Now, are these under 40s going to evolve like kind of my generation did out of the sort of the hippie world? Nobody knows for sure, but it can happen. So we don't know what kind of, once they sort of get their voting patterns established, which side of the fence they're going to fall on, because we've seen that vary in past generations as well, and it could here. I will just tell you, for our opportunities right now, as I see that crowd, this is a crowd that is very, very engaged in food, period. I mean, they're, the term, of course, that everybody uses are foodies. My 4 kids are foodies, very, fascinated by food production, what's in their food, how it's produced, who produced it, where it came from. I mean, sort of all of those kind of metaphors out there, they're all into that. And I think that does sort of describe a lot the under 40 crowd. And in some ways that can be a challenge to us, but in other ways, we've really got the structure where it fits nicely with, I think, the general goals of that community. I mean, despite what, CNN or ABC News or somebody like that may report, I mean, 97% of our farming base in this country is still, a family farm sort of network out there. And this is what this crowd wants. I mean, they want to buy from someone they can relate to. They want to buy from a farmer who's, thinking about handing this off to the next generation. I mean, we check a lot of those boxes. And so I don't necessarily fear them being foodies. I just wish we did a better job of communicating our own stories about food and agriculture and who we are to that community, because I think it would be a positive message and actually not be something that would result in trouble for us, but maybe even better marketing opportunities.
Yeah, I'm getting your dry throat here, Chuck.
I apologize for that, Kevin. We're having an ice storm here in DC today, and I think I've caught a little of the crud that's in the air here. So,
yeah, I think we sent it to you from Kansas. So
yeah, hopefully not as much as you got.
Well, yeah. So I don't see any other questions coming up here. We'll give it just another minute or two. In the meantime, so talk a little bit more about social media. And I don't mean, I don't bash social media. I just don't use it much myself. I don't mean to bash or anything, but I did watch a show, non-faith-based show on Netflix called The Social Dilemma here a while back. And it was pretty concerning when people that have non-Christian values necessarily that work for some of the social media sources are saying, boy, I'm not going to let my kids engage with this and stuff. So I'm not wanting to bash it, but just if you could just kind of talk a little bit about the threats that you see that could come from social media, and how do we offset those challenges and those threats?
Well, it's a great question, Kevin. Let me try and address it, in the world that I know. I've got a lot of views on other things too, but, the world that I know pretty well is politics. So I better stay, I'll at least start out staying focused there. And let me just say that among friends here, I have often said that I am not sure that our representative form of government today can survive the world of social media. And I know that's a very strong and sort of alarming kind of statement, but it is how I feel. And what do I mean by that? I'll answer it this way. When I first came to Washington in 1980, as a young kid right off the farm out of Purdue, our political system was something like this, where those long periods of being in session and debating, members of Congress would come to Washington and they would stay here. And they would do the business of the government. If Congress took a long weekend or during summer breaks or stuff like that, of course they would go home, as best they could. But basically, their business was here in Washington, and because of that, they were together with each other. They socialized together. They gathered for dinner parties together. They were friends, and their friends, it was a common bond, and many, lived here, went to church here, worshiped with, their colleagues, that sort of thing. And, that's sort of created that, that bond that existed out there among members of Congress. And they came to Washington, basically, they weren't detached from the folks back home. Of course, there were letters coming in and, phone calls and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, they sort of did the business of the country in Washington. And when they got those opportunities, then they went home and they told their constituents what they had done. You know, I voted this way for these reasons. And you know, I hope you support that, because I thought this was, you know, the best direction for the country. And, you know, the voters, of course, at the next election would judge them based upon those votes. Our system does not work that way today, Kevin, with social media. Oftentimes, you know, a member of Congress will go vote, and literally before they are back in their office from casting that vote, they are trending on social media back home, you know, with people basically saying, you would not believe what that moron just did, you know, and sort of, you know, crucify it. That's a bad word, I guess, in this crowd, but, you know, really go after them. And, you know, they haven't even had a chance to go back to their office and do an interview to explain, you know, I voted this way for A, B, and C. Instead, you know, just based upon the vote itself, they have been sort of hit that way. And because of that, you know, members of Congress are on pins and needles, and they hate roll call votes. They hate to vote. And every year in Congress, we set a new record for fewer number of roll call votes. And what that basically translates into, it's not that much different than other jobs. If, you know, if what you do, which is vote on issues, gets smaller and smaller, you know, their productivity and what they're getting accomplished goes down and down each year, because they are fundamentally afraid to vote, to be held accountable on social media for those circumstances when they don't even really have an opportunity to explain what it is they've done. And it's an eggshell political environment. It's impacting everything we do. And again, I not sounding very optimistic here, I know, but you know, can our system of representative form of government, where we send somebody to Washington to sort of be our voice and to vote and to debate in our behalf, can that system survive this sort of instantaneous communication world where somebody can jump up and literally make any claim, and suddenly 10 million people, you know, are reading that claim? And I think it's still an open question.
Now, I tell you, there's been a lot of positives with social media, but there's also been some of these things that were not anticipated, I think, too, that have been pretty big challenges. So, well, it looks like we've answered all the questions that we've had to this point, Chuck. So I want to thank you again for taking time to participate in this today. Please feel free to hang out with the rest of the audience here as we move on to the next speaker. So really appreciate what you do in Washington on behalf of agriculture, and helping look out for the American farmer here. So
Kevin,
again,
thanks for having me be a part of this inaugural event. I'm very honored to do that. Thank you.
Thank you, Chuck. All right, I'm gonna let you